They told me the village was dead. Not empty. Not abandoned. Dead. I stepped out of the rusted van onto a gravel path soaked in blackened rain. The driver, a man with a face like cracked leather, didn't even look at me as he closed the door and reversed back down the winding forest road. He hadn't spoken since I told him where I was going. Just a muttered prayer when I said Viduva. The silence swallowed everything. Ahead of me, the path twisted into a line of crooked houses. The roofs slouched. Windows were boarded or broken. Smoke didn't rise from the chimneys, though I could smell something, burned hair and old wax, in the air. The village looked as though it had been weeping for years, and the rain was just the world's way of hiding it. I adjusted the strap of my leather satchel and walked toward the church. The mud sucked at my boots like hands. Dead crows hung from the trees, their wings tied with red string, heads bowed like they were ashamed. I passed a shrine made of bones and candle wax melted into the shape of a child. Someone had scratched a name into the stone behind it. Tomasz. Father Tomasz. The priest I came to find. The priest who hadn't written in over a month. I was supposed to report in, follow protocol, contact the diocese. But the truth is, I didn't want anyone else involved in this one. Not after what happened in Marseille. Not after her. The rain thickened. I reached the crest of a small hill and saw it, the church. It sat crooked at the village's center, leaning to one side like a drunk trying to pray. Ivy strangled its stone spine, and the bell tower was nothing more than a jagged hole against the gray sky. Yet even from this distance I felt it. A pull, like something behind those cracked doors knew I was coming. As I approached, the wind picked up, howling low through the trees. It didn't sound natural. It sounded like breathing, long, wet, and close. I paused at the old iron gate. A symbol had been carved into the rust, a spiral within a circle, the lines jagged like they were made in a hurry. I'd seen it before, in old texts buried deep in the Vatican archives. It meant, bound but not forgotten. The church doors creaked open before I touched them. Not wide, just enough. Like an invitation. I hesitated, heart thudding harder than I'd like to admit. I reached into my coat and pulled out the crucifix, silver, old, slightly bent. It had been my mentor's. He wore it until the day the demon carved its name into his ribs. I kissed it. Then I stepped inside. The air changed immediately. It was warmer, somehow wrongly so. The inside was draped in dust and candle soot. The pews had been pushed aside, forming a wide circle in the center of the floor. Burn marks scorched the edges. Ritual work. At the far end, the altar was smashed. The cross above it had been turned upside down, not by vandals, but by hands that knew what that meant. On the floor, something was written in ash. Latin. Venient. Vocavit. Manet. They came. He called. It waits. I knelt beside it, brushing ash from the letters, trying to make sense of the patterns scorched into the stone. My hand touched something cold. A tooth. Human. Blood still clinging to the root. I stood, slowly, and then I heard it. The bell. A single, hollow ring from the tower above me. But that tower had collapsed 50 years ago. I'd seen the records. The stone crumbled in the earthquake of 54. And yet, another ring. Louder. Closer. Something was ringing it for me. That's when I saw the shadow, standing in the pulpit. It wasn't there a second ago. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The shadow didn't either. We just stood in the silence, staring at each other. Then it leaned forward, and I heard a voice, dry, cracked, like bark splitting in winter. "You're late, Edward." I dropped the crucifix, because the voice wasn't unfamiliar. It was her voice. The girl I failed to save. The one who burned alive in Marseille while I held the holy water too tightly in my hand, paralyzed. The church went dark, and I finally realized I wasn't here to investigate a haunting. I was part of the ritual. The wind howled through the narrow alleyways of Viduva like a warning whispered too late. I wrapped my coat tighter around me and stepped through the heavy wooden doors of the church. The hinges groaned like something alive, and a bitter cold followed me in. Inside, the church was darker than it should have been, even with the stained glass windows letting in dull morning light. It smelled of old stone, wet wood, and something else I couldn't name yet. Not sulfur, not decay. It was hollow, like a room that had forgotten how to breathe. My boots echoed as I walked down the central aisle. Pews sat crooked. Bibles were scattered, pages torn, as if a storm had passed through without touching a single wall. The crucifix above the altar was tilted, and behind it, a velvet curtain moved though there was no wind. Then I saw him. A boy, maybe 10, maybe younger, sitting in the third pew on the left. pale, thin, his knees tucked into his chest. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but with something colder. Resignation. Like he'd seen this place long before I had. "You're not from here," he said without turning. "No," I replied. "And you?" He looked at me then. Eyes gray like ash, voice flat. "I was born here. I can't leave." "What's your name?" "Alan." "Why are you here, Alan?" "In the church, I mean." He pointed toward the old wooden confessional box. Its door was slightly ajar, shadows clinging to its edges like wet cloth. "Someone's in there," he said. "He doesn't come out." I frowned. "A priest?" He shook his head. "No, not anymore." I approached the confessional slowly. The wood was rotting, splintered near the handle, and old blood stained the side, dry, crusted. I knelt slightly and placed my ear near the screen. Nothing. Then, just as I began to pull away, I heard it. A whisper. Too soft to catch, but it was there. Like breath on glass. I pressed closer, holding my own breath. "You're late." I froze. The voice was wrong. Not angry. Not welcoming. Just aware. It knew me. "Who are you?" I asked, keeping my tone steady. Silence. I opened the confessional door. Nothing inside. Just dust, a cracked wooden stool, and a thick Bible left open to a page soaked in something dark. I leaned in. The page had been torn through the center, the ink smudged, but one verse remained clear. "And no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light." I closed the door and turned back to Alan. "How long has someone been inside?" He shrugged. "Since Father Tomasz disappeared. People say he went mad. But I think the man in the box made him that way." "What man?" Alan didn't answer. Instead, he pointed upward, toward the belfry. "There's a bell," he said. "It rings at night. Even though it's broken. You'll hear it soon." I stared at the rusted spiral staircase that led up into the tower. Most of the steps had collapsed. The bell had fallen decades ago during a storm. According to the Vatican file, the tower hadn't been entered since 1978. Yet Alan said it rings. And part of me believed him. Before I could ask more, Alan stood and began walking toward the exit. "Wait," I said. "Where are your parents?" He paused, then looked over his shoulder. His voice was barely a whisper. "They confessed to the man in the box." And then he was gone. I stood there, alone in that broken church, watching dust dance in the dim light. The silence pressed against me like a second skin. I felt something stir behind the curtain near the altar, but I didn't look. Not yet. Instead, I sat in the pew Alan had left behind and took out my journal. My hands were trembling, just slightly. I wrote the words down carefully. Entry number 281. Confessional box contains no priest. Voices heard. Direct address. You're late. Child witness, Alan, reports nightly bell and man in the box. Further investigation required. Trust instincts. Do not speak aloud near confessional again. As I finished writing, a cold breeze brushed the back of my neck. And though I hadn't rung it, I swore I heard the bell. Just once. Far above, in the ruined tower. It was beginning. I couldn't sleep. The wind kept pressing against the windows like it had weight. And every time I closed my eyes, I heard the girl's voice again, the one I failed to save years ago. Her whispers were soft at first, like leaves brushing across stone, but then they'd shift, becoming wet, cracking sounds like someone chewing glass in the dark. By morning, my hands were shaking. I lit a candle and forced myself to walk back to the church. The chapel looked worse in daylight. Ivy had crept over the broken walls, crawling up toward the bell tower that no longer stood. The front door hung off one hinge, groaning when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was colder than outside. It smelled of mildew and burned wax. The pews were cracked, some tipped over like there'd been a panic once, and no one had bothered to clean it up. I stood at the altar, trying to center my thoughts, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching from the upper choir loft. Then I saw it, a faint outline on the stone floor beneath the altar. I knelt down and ran my fingers over the grooves. It wasn't random. It was a seal. An old one. A trapdoor. The shape was circular, drawn in chalk or maybe ash, with tiny letters scrawled along the rim. I recognized none of them. They weren't Latin. Not Aramaic. Not even Hebrew. The iron handle was fused with rust. It hadn't been opened in years, maybe decades. I tugged gently, but it didn't move. Something told me not to force it. Not yet. That's when I heard it, a faint creak, like footsteps on old wood. I spun around. No one was there. But on the last row of pews, a leather book had appeared. It hadn't been there before. I picked it up slowly, half expecting it to vanish in my hands. The leather was cracked, soaked in places, like it had been buried. I opened the first page. Father Tomasz, log 37. It was his journal. The ink had bled through some of the pages, but I could still read most of it. March 9th. They told me the thing beneath the altar is dormant. But it dreams. Last night, I heard it praying. Not to God. To something else. March 12th. The villagers won't speak about the old pact, but their eyes betray them. They look at me like I'm already dead. March 14th. The confessional is unusable. Blood leaks from the wood. I saw a face behind the curtain, but no one was inside. March 16th. A man named Neves visited the chapel today. Said he used to serve here long ago. But his face doesn't move like ours. I don't think he blinks. I felt cold sink into my bones. The name was underlined, Neves. I flipped through the remaining pages. The last entry was only half a sentence. He's not a demon. He's older than that. And then nothing. Just a streak of ink, as if the pen had been yanked away. I looked around. The church was silent again. But I knew Father Tomasz hadn't left. Not willingly. And whatever he discovered down there, beneath the altar, was still waiting. As I stood up, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A smear of red on the stone wall behind the altar. It wasn't paint. It was a word, written in blood, barely legible but clear enough to understand. Too late. I backed away slowly, heart hammering against my ribs. Something was wrong with this place. It didn't just feel cursed, it knew me. It had waited for me. And I had no idea if I was here to end this, or to finish what someone else started. I closed the journal and walked out of the church, the bell tower groaning above me like a dead throat trying to speak. It was still morning, but I swear the sun had gotten darker. The nights in Viduva had a weight to them. Not just darkness, weight. Like the air had grown thick with memory, and each breath pulled someone else's sin into your lungs. I hadn't slept much since arriving. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard whispers. Latin phrases I hadn't spoken in years. Screams I'd tried to forget. And always, the sound of the church bell. It rang around 2 or 3 in the morning, never the same time twice. The villagers told me it couldn't ring. The tower had collapsed long ago. But it rang. That night, I sat by the window of the rectory with a candle flickering beside my journal. I had been copying notes from Father Tomasz's last sermon, trying to make sense of a passage he had underlined again and again. The flesh is a veil. Behind it, truth is always watching. Then I saw him. A figure, just barely visible in the moonlight, moving through the old graveyard behind the chapel. Slow. Deliberate. His cloak dragged across the ground, like it was too heavy for his shoulders. He didn't carry a lantern, yet he walked like he knew every step. Like he belonged to the dark. My heart thudded once, twice, and then started racing. I put down the pen and reached for my coat. I didn't think. I just followed. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the ground was soft and sticky. Mud clung to my boots as I crossed the yard. The grave markers looked older at night, cracked, leaning, names long washed away. I passed one that simply read, "Forgiven." The figure was entering the chapel. The doors were still chained shut. I'd seen to that myself. But somehow, I heard the groan of hinges. I reached the front steps and saw the rusted chains hanging loose. Someone had cut them. Inside, it was darker than it should have been. Even with the broken stained glass and gaping holes in the roof, the moonlight barely touched the floor. The air smelled of damp stone and something else, something foul, like old meat left out in the sun. "Hello!" I called out. My voice didn't echo. It just died in the air. No answer. I stepped further in. The pews were all facing the wrong way, as if turned by angry hands. The crucifix above the altar was gone. In its place was a blackened stain on the wall, shaped like a man with arms outstretched. Then I heard breathing. It was slow and deep. Not human. Like wind dragging through a hollow chest. I turned toward the confessional. The doors were cracked open. The same confessional where I'd heard whispers before. Now, the light from my candle revealed something scrawled across the wood in blood. Fresh, wet blood. "You're late." I stepped back. My candle flickered violently. Then something moved behind the slats. Just a shadow at first, shifting, like smoke pressed into flesh. A face leaned forward. Pale. Hairless. Eyes that weren't eyes at all, just hollow pits filled with red shimmer. It smiled. And then it spoke, not aloud, but directly into my head. "Do you miss her, Edward?" I froze. No one knew about her. Not here. Not in this forgotten village. Not the child I couldn't save. Not the reason I left Rome. Not the reason I wake up some nights with blood on my hands and prayer half finished on my lips. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back at the rectory, slamming the door and locking every bolt. My candle had gone out somewhere along the way, but I didn't notice. I stood in the kitchen, drenched in sweat, trying to remember how to breathe. Then the bell rang. Once. Twice. 3 times. I looked out the window again, and saw him, standing in the broken church window, cloaked, motionless, watching me. I woke up to the sound of the wind scraping against the shutters. It was still dark outside, but something about the silence felt different, thicker, like the air was holding its breath. I lit the oil lamp and sat up, my clothes still damp from the night before. The church loomed outside my window, black and broken against the early morning sky. I knew what I had to do today. I had been putting it off, afraid of what I might find, but the time for fear was over. The rectory's back room had a study, and used and heavy with dust. It smelled of dried wax and old mold. I searched through the drawers and cabinets, hoping Father Tomasz had left behind something, anything, that could explain what was happening. At the bottom of a drawer, hidden beneath crumpled sheets and brittle newspaper clippings, I found it, a leather-bound journal with a cracked spine. A bookmark of dried rosemary stuck out of the middle. On the first page, written in a neat, slanted script, Father Tomasz, for God's eyes, or the one who comes after me. My fingers trembled as I turned the pages. At first, it read like any priest's diary, sermons, names of the ill, descriptions of village life. But slowly the entries darkened. The boy, Alan, screamed again in his sleep. Latin this time. But he's never studied it. During Mass, a woman began laughing. She claimed to see a man behind me, though no one else did. The bell rang last night, but the tower hasn't stood since the fire in '67. I confronted him. Neves is not what he says he is. The name hit me like a nail in the chest. I had heard it before, whispered in confessions, buried in Vatican archives. It wasn't a name. It was a title in a forgotten tongue. One of the 7 bound. A watcher turned devourer. He's not a demon. He's older than that. Something the church chose to forget. That sentence trailed off halfway down the page, the ink smeared, as if the pen was yanked from his hand. I closed the book and stared at the flame of the lamp. It flickered violently, like something had just breathed across the room. I took the journal and left the rectory. The village square was empty. The fountain in the center, once filled with holy water, was now bone dry and filled with ash. I walked toward the mayor's home, a sagging stone building covered in ivy and rot. He opened the door after my 3rd knock. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands stained with something dark. He didn't ask why I was there. He only stepped aside. We sat in silence for a moment. Then I asked, "Who is Neves?" The mayor's mouth tightened. He looked at the floor. "He was here before us. Before the church. Before the books. We don't speak his name. But you know what he is." He nodded. "We thought we could live with it. So long as the rituals were kept, he didn't touch the children. The crops grew. The rain came." I stared at him in disbelief. "You fed him." He didn't deny it. "Father Tomasz tried to stop it," he said. "He thought faith could replace the bargain. But faith doesn't grow food. And prayers don't keep Neves asleep." My hands curled into fists. "You made a pact with something infernal." The mayor looked at me with tired, hollow eyes. "We didn't make the pact. Our ancestors did. We just never broke it." I left his home without another word. As I walked back through the village, I noticed them watching. Faces in windows, children peeking from behind doors. None of them smiled. None of them spoke. They all looked like they were waiting for something. Or someone. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard it again. The bell. 1, 2, 3 slow tolls. And then silence. Except for a voice, right outside my door. It whispered, "Welcome home, Edward." The sun had no warmth that morning. It hovered low, shrouded behind a veil of pale fog, casting long gray shadows across the cemetery behind the church. I sat on the stone steps, holding Father Tomasz's torn journal in my lap, the last page trembling in the wind. The words were rushed, written in a frantic, broken scrawl. "He's not a demon. He's older than that." Older than a demon? That thought clung to me like the damp chill in my bones. I couldn't explain it, but I knew, whatever Neves was, whatever it wanted, it wasn't just evil. It was deliberate, patient, ancient. The pages smelled like smoke and old blood. I closed the book and stood. I needed answers. So I went to the only man who still spoke without trembling, Mary Lee. He lived in the largest house at the edge of town, a crooked structure with iron crosses nailed into the wood. When I knocked, I didn't expect him to answer so quickly. His eyes were already waiting through the glass. He let me in without a word. The inside was filled with strange things, dried herbs, jars of black salt, and paintings of saints with the faces scratched off. It smelled like burnt meat. "Sit," he said, motioning toward an old table. I sat. "You read the journal?" he asked. "Yes." He said, "Neves isn't a demon." Ili nodded slowly. "Because he's not. Not by name. Not by heaven's standards. He came before names were written." I stared at him. "Then what is he?" He leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's what we invited." I didn't speak. I didn't breathe. He went on, eyes lowered. "This village was cursed. Centuries ago. Crops failed, wolves took our children, the river turned black. So the elders summoned something from the soil beneath the chapel. Something hungry. It promised protection. It asked only for offerings. Sinners. Drunks. Thieves. The dying. And you gave them?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "We did what we had to. For generations, we kept the pact. And the village flourished again. Quiet. Hidden from war. From plague. But the balance was fragile." I felt my hands tightening into fists. "And Father Tomasz?" Ili looked away. He tried to end it. Tried to seal the crypt permanently. He thought prayer was enough. He forgot that this thing was not bound by scripture. He vanished the day he said, "We no longer fear it." That was his sin. My throat was dry. "Why bring me here?" Ili raised his eyes. They were heavy with something like pity. "Because the pact was broken, and now the price must be paid in full." "What price?" "You." The silence between us was a blade. He continued, slowly, deliberately. "Neves doesn't just want any soul. He waits for one born of this soil, baptized under a stolen name. Your mother, Edward. She was from Viduva. Fled the pact. Hid you from it. But blood remembers." I stood up, heart pounding. "You brought me here to die. To finish it," he said, not looking away. "Or to trap it again if you can. You carry both judgment and mercy. That makes you the final piece." I backed away from the table. "You used God's name to feed a devil," I hissed. Ili didn't flinch. "And you use his name to pretend you still believe." I left. I walked into the cold with my breath shaking before me. The church tower stood crooked in the fog, its bell silent for now. But I felt it, deep below, waiting, listening. The air tasted like ash. In my pocket, I felt the weight of the crucifix I hadn't worn in days. I pulled it out, stared at it, and whispered, "If I'm the peace, then let me choose where it ends." And I walked toward the church, toward the trap, toward the truth. The trapdoor was colder than the air around it. Even without touching it, I could feel a strange chill leaking from the cracks, like it breathed frost into the air. The sigil carved into its iron was worn, but it pulsed faintly beneath my lantern light, almost like veins under pale skin. I knelt, pressing my hand against the seal. The iron burned, not with heat, but with a sharp cold that bit through my bones. I muttered a prayer, barely more than a whisper. "In nomine Patris, et Filii." The door groaned. It opened without resistance. A thick gust of air escaped, old, bitter, and heavy with the scent of mold, wax, and something else. Something coppery. I held the lantern low and began my descent into the crypt. The staircase was stone, spiral, and narrow. My shoulder brushed the damp walls as I moved. Cobwebs clung to my face. Water dripped steadily from somewhere above. Each step echoed far too long, as if the darkness below had no bottom. When my feet finally touched flat ground, the light revealed a vast, circular chamber. The air was thick. Breathing felt like drinking. There were pillars, 6 of them, each carved with scripture in a language I didn't recognize. They were cracked, crumbling, but still standing. In the center of the room, an altar of black stone stood like a coffin left open. Around it, charred bones formed a ring. They weren't arranged by accident. I stepped closer. Human bones. Small ones too. Children. I looked away, bow rising in my throat. Then I saw it, painted across the far wall in what I prayed was only paint. My name, Edward. Below it, scratched deep into the stone, "Welcome home." The hairs on my neck stood up. I turned in a slow circle, listening. Nothing. Then a soft voice behind me. "I've been waiting." I spun, heart slamming against my ribs. The voice was familiar. Too familiar. And there he was. Neves. He looked human. Tall, pale, dressed in old priest's robes that were too clean for this place. His hair was dark and combed. His hands were folded in front of him, as if in prayer. His eyes, though, those weren't human. They were black and deep, like two wells with no bottom. "Do you know why you're here, Edward?" he asked calmly. My mouth was dry. I couldn't speak. He stepped forward slowly, hands still folded. "You think you came to cleanse? To finish what Tomash began? To free these people?" He tilted his head. "But you're late." He was the last one who had time. I found my voice. "You're not a priest." He smiled. "No, but I was." A chill crept down my spine. "You're Neves." "I am what remains of him," he said, walking a slow circle around me. I wore the robes. I spoke the words. And when no one else would listen, the village did. They gave me a place. A name. Worship. He paused at the altar. They fed me. I looked at the bones again. He followed my gaze. The ones who deserved it, of course. Thieves. Murderers. Liars. He smiled wider. Eventually, anyone with doubt. "You twisted them," I said. "Turned faith into fear." He shrugged. "They came to me for protection. I simply asked for something in return." My grip tightened on the crucifix in my pocket. "You knew I would come. I brought you here," he said gently. "Your failures led you. Your guilt carved the path." He stopped in front of me. "You see, Edward, they were never after Tomash. Or the village. Or the altar." His eyes locked onto mine. "They were after you." The walls groaned. The pillars cracked louder. I felt the ground shake beneath my feet. "What do you want from me?" I whispered. He leaned in, breath cold on my face. "Your soul," he said softly. "Freely given." And then he vanished, like smoke folding into the dark. I was alone again. But the altar was no longer empty. A single candle flickered to life on its surface. And something underneath it was breathing. I couldn't breathe. The air beneath the church was thick, like syrup and smoke had mixed and filled my lungs. The stone corridor behind me had disappeared. What remained ahead was a circular chamber lit by hundreds of candles that hadn't burned down in what looked like centuries. They formed a pattern on the ground. A spiral. At the center of it stood the altar. Not the kind with linen and chalices. This one was made of black stone, veined like it bled from within. And beside it stood him. Neves. He wore priestly robes, spotless, ironed, and wrong. His hands were behind his back like he was waiting for a choir to begin. His face, youthful but ancient, turned toward me as if he'd been listening to my thoughts. "Ah," he said, voice smooth as oil. "The priest arrives. Only slightly too late." I didn't respond. I walked forward, gripping the crucifix in my hand. My fingers trembled, not from fear, at least that's what I told myself, but from something deeper. Like I was standing before a truth I'd tried to forget. "You've seen what I've done to the others," Neves continued. "They screamed. You won't. You'll try to pray instead. Let's see how far it gets you." I stopped at the edge of the spiral and raised the crucifix. "In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti." My voice cracked. I forced it steady. "By the authority of the Church, I command you, Neves, creature of darkness, to be bound by the will of God. I cast you out." The air shimmered. The flames of the candles leaned inward, like they were bowing. Neves blinked slowly. "You don't believe in that anymore." "I do." "No," he said. "You believe in punishment. In guilt. In failure. That's not faith, Edward." He took one step forward. I felt heat against my palm. I looked down. The silver crucifix, my mentor's cross, was glowing. Then it hissed. I screamed and dropped it. It clattered to the stones like a dead weight. "Your tools are ash," Neves whispered. I reached into my coat for the flask of holy water. As I lifted it, he simply breathed, and the glass shattered in my hand. Shards sliced my palm, blood dripping into the spiral lines on the floor. It sizzled where it landed. I stumbled back. "I won't run." "Of course you won't. You're the lamb. The faithful always walk into the slaughter." He began circling me, hands still behind his back. "Tell me, Edward, what was her name?" I froze. "Her," he said again. "The girl. The one who begged you to help her. What was her name, before the demon took her and you stood there shaking?" I clenched my fists. "Elena." "Ah, yes. Elena. So small. So scared. And you, God's soldier, what did you do?" My heart thundered. "You whispered prayers like they were apologies," he said. "And when her neck broke, you cried. Not because she died, but because you failed again." I took a step forward. "She fought harder than I ever did. She died, he snapped, voice hard for the first time. Because you think rituals save people. You think Latin and silver and trembling hands hold power. He walked toward me slowly, shadows curling around his feet. I want your soul, Edward. Not because it's holy, but because it's full of cracks. You're hollow. That makes you drinkable. The chamber rumbled. I collapsed to one knee. My skin felt like it was peeling, my eyes burned, my mouth filled with ash. Somewhere behind me, I thought I heard a scream. It sounded like me. Then, silence. Neves stood inches from me, reaching down like a father offering help to his broken son. Let go, he said gently. Your God stopped listening long ago. I looked up at him. But I didn't let go. I whispered, voice barely audible. Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. He recoiled, just slightly. I failed. I doubted. I hated him for sending me into places like this. For showing me evil and never answering when I begged. The room grew colder. But I believe now. Not because I see him, but because you're here. And something in me still wants to fight you. A low growl filled the chamber. Not from Neves, but from the shadows themselves. I reached out and touched the spiral on the ground. My blood was still fresh in its grooves. I spoke again, softly, clearly. I am not afraid of you. The candles flickered. Some blew out. And Neves took a step back. The first since I entered. His smile twisted. We'll see. Then the possessed girl burst through the shadows behind him. It was Anna's granddaughter. Eyes rolled white, mouth sewn shut with threads of hair. She ran with a jagged blade of bone and drove it into her own chest, right over the altar. The blood sprayed across the spiral. Neves inhaled like a starving man. Power surged through the room. The candles blazed bright white. The spiral cracked. He turned to me, now with something between hunger and rage. You've bought yourself time, he hissed. But you're still too late. I couldn't breathe. The air inside the crypt had thickened, pressing down on me like a wet shroud. The light from my lantern flickered, then died. I was left in complete darkness, except for the red glow pulsing from the altar ahead. It wasn't a natural light. It was alive, beating like a heart. The kind of heart that never should have been. Neves stood behind it, half in shadow, half illuminated by the hellish hue. He wore Father Tomas's robes now, blood-soaked and torn. His hands were folded, calm as ever, and his eyes glowed faintly with something older than fire. You've come far, he said, voice smooth like a prayer laced with poison. Further than the last one. Or the one before that. I didn't answer. I gripped my rosary until it dug into my palm. I could feel the silver warming, too warm. Neves tilted his head, smiling. Still clinging to that little chain of beads? You think it means anything down here? I opened my mouth to speak, to begin the rite. But the words, they didn't come. My throat locked. My vision blurred. I felt something pressing on my mind, like fingers trying to peel it open. Go on, he whispered. Say your lines. Latin won't help you. Scripture won't save you. You know that. I dropped to my knees. Not from weakness. From truth. I wasn't ready. I never had been. Not when the girl died in Turin. Not when the church begged me to return. Not now, with a demon in front of me and no angels left to call. I looked up, eyes wet. You want to hear something? I said, voice trembling. Neves raised an eyebrow. I failed her. That girl, her name was Clara. I never told anyone. Not really. She begged me to stop the ritual. Said the demon wasn't in her. I didn't listen. I pressed the cross against her chest until it burned. I thought pain would drive it out. Neves' smile faded. I didn't cast out anything, I said. I only made her scream. And when she died, I told the others it was the demon's doing. But it wasn't. It was me. The walls around us pulsed. Stone wept dark liquid. The sigils began to flicker. Neves took a step back. What are you doing? He asked, voice quieter now. Confessing. I stood slowly, one hand on my chest. Not holding the cross. Just holding myself together. I don't care about the Latin, I said. I don't care about the rituals. I came here thinking I was stronger. That I'd finish what others couldn't. But I was wrong. My voice grew firmer. I'm not a weapon. I'm not holy. I'm just a man, broken, grieving, and afraid. And I'm sorry. For Clara. For every soul I failed. For pretending I was anything more than dust. The crypt began to tremble. From the cracks in the walls, screams echoed. Not angry screams. Not demonic. Human. Dozens. Hundreds. Neves' skin shifted, too quickly to follow. He snarled, backing toward the altar. You think guilt can stop me? No, I whispered. But truth can. With every word of confession, something broke. Not inside me, but around me. The circle of bones at the altar shattered. Flames burst from the cracks in the floor and spiraled upward, dancing like ribbons. They didn't burn me. They danced around me, warm, forgiving. The spirits of the sacrificed had heard. Neves screamed, the first time I'd heard him without control. His form flickered, tearing between man and something vast and horned and shapeless. "Edward," he bellowed. "You are mine." I took a step forward. My voice calm now. "I was never yours." And then the bell rang. The one above the ruined tower. The one that had no bell inside it. It rang like thunder, like a choir of grief, like a mother's last prayer. And for the first time in years, I felt the weight lift from my soul. The seal was cracking, and Neves knew it. But this wasn't over yet. Not until the last confession was heard. I never thought I'd climb that tower again. Not after the screams. Not after the blood. Not after Neves whispered my name in the dark like it belonged to him. But here I was, my hands covered in ash and dried blood, gripping the stone steps that spiraled upward like a throat meant to swallow me whole. The air was thick, not just with dust, but with something wrong. Like it didn't want me here. Like the tower itself still remembered what had been bound beneath it. The church bell above me had long since cracked. Records said it fell during a lightning strike in 1948. But I heard it last night, and the night before that, ringing through the fog like a call from something deep and old. I reached the top, gasping. My ribs ached. My vision blurred. Below, I could see the chapel's twisted roof and the outline of the graveyard where tombstones tilted like crooked teeth. Smoke curled from the crypt entrance where Neves had descended. His ritual had begun. The voices of the dead were getting louder. And I had run. I'd left the altar. I'd abandoned the fight. Again. Just like before. But then I heard her. A girl's voice. "Don't let him finish, Edward." It was her. The one I failed. Maria. I don't know if it was real. Maybe I was losing my mind. But her voice cut through the noise. It steadied me. So I stood beneath the shattered arch and looked at the bell. It was still hanging. Cracked, rusted, but whole enough. And I knew what I had to do. I wrapped both hands around the frayed rope. It burned against my palms, the fibers slicing into old blisters. My shoulder screamed as I pulled. The bell groaned like something waking from a long, bitter sleep. Then it rang. Once. And the sound, God help me, the sound wasn't just a noise. It pierced the world. It shattered the silence like glass and reached down into the earth. It wasn't just heard. It was felt, like thunder shaking your bones from the inside. The church trembled. Bricks split. I heard glass explode below. And then I heard the screaming. Not from Neves. From them. The ones who had been buried in the crypt. Sacrifices. Offerings. Innocence. Their voices rose, all at once, howling through the stone like a tide of agony and rage. I dropped to my knees. The bell still swayed above me, but I couldn't look away from the sky. It had turned black. Not night black, void black. Like something had swallowed the stars and replaced them with teeth. And in the silence between each toll of the bell, I heard Neves' voice, lower than before, furious, not calm anymore. "You stupid priest. You called them." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mouth was dry. My heart was somewhere in my throat. The next toll hit harder. The air split open. I watched smoke pour from the crypt like a river rising backward. And with it came shapes, half human, half ash. The souls that had never been given peace. The forgotten. Neves had fed on them for years. Now they remembered. And they were angry. They flew into the church, swirling, shrieking, clawing at the walls. The windows blew outward. Fire danced where holy water had been. I saw Neves stumble at the altar, no longer composed, no longer mocking. His hands rose to shield himself, but the spirits didn't stop. I kept pulling. 1 ring. 2 rings. 3. With every toll, more of them came. I don't know how long I stayed there, pulling that rope like it was the only thing tethering me to the living world. But finally the bell stopped. It didn't break. It chose to stop. The silence after was worse than the noise. I fell to my side, chest heaving. My arms refused to move. Blood soaked my wrists. And for a long time, I just stared at the sky, empty again, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. I had heard Neves scream. That meant something. Below, the chapel was still. The wind had died. The fog had vanished. Even the graveyard seemed to rest. I knew the final part was still ahead. I had shaken the monster. But I hadn't killed it. Not yet. And if I failed this time, there would be no bell left to ring. I couldn't feel my legs at first. My body was sprawled across the cold, cracked stones of the altar chamber, face pressed into dust and dried blood. Every breath hurt, like it was being dragged through shattered glass. My ears rang from the bell I had rung. God, had I really rung it? And my hands still clutched the frayed rope like it was part of me. But the silence was complete. No whispers, no mocking laughter, no Neves. I pushed myself up slowly, bones screaming, and looked around. The underground altar was gone. Or maybe it had never been there. The walls were smooth again, pale with morning light filtering through broken boards high above. No blood, no bodies, only silence and the soft smell of rain-soaked earth. My crucifix, burned into my skin the night before, now lay cool and still against my chest. I forced myself to my feet. The church above had collapsed partially during the chaos, but the front doors, they were open now. Light spilled in like water, warm and golden, painting the pews with something I hadn't seen in weeks. Peace. I limped up the aisle, passing where I'd first found the teeth, the burned scriptures, the shadows that had once spoken to me. Now there was nothing but empty space. And then I saw it. The bell tower. Still ruined. Still broken. But the bell was whole. My breath caught. I blinked hard, thinking my eyes were playing tricks. But no. It hung there, perfect and still, as if the last 50 years had never happened. As if the demon had never used it to lure souls. As if time had been reversed. Or sealed. I staggered outside. The village looked the same, but the tension in the air had vanished. I saw 2 boys playing near the well. A woman sweeping her porch. Chickens clucking in the dirt. The air smelled of bread, not blood. And for the first time since I'd arrived, I heard laughter. A kind, soft laugh from an old man sitting by the chapel wall. He nodded at me as I passed, like we'd known each other in a dream. I wanted to ask if they remembered, if they knew what had nearly awakened beneath them. But something told me not to. Some truths were not meant to be spoken twice. I walked down the hill, toward the waiting van that would take me to the hospital in Bucharest. I didn't look back. Not once. Because I knew. He was gone. Not destroyed. No. That's not how things like Neves end. They sleep. They sink. They wait for weak hearts and broken faith. But for now the seal was whole. And I had not been too late. At least not this time. But as the van drove away and the village faded in the distance, I felt something cold against my leg. I reached into my coat pocket. It was a single page from Father Tomáš's journal. The last page. The one that had ended mid-sentence. Now there were new words burned into the bottom. Words I had never seen before. Thank you, Edward. He sleeps again. But dreams dream loud. I folded it shut. And said nothing. It's been 3 weeks since Viduva. My hands still shake when I try to hold a pen. The doctors say it's nerve damage, maybe stress. They don't know about the demon in the chapel beneath the earth. They don't believe in things like Neves. Most people don't. I've been writing again, though. My journal, entry 314. I used to number them like they were just reports. Evidence. Clean. But this one doesn't feel like a case file. It feels like a memory that won't let go. They found me lying on the chapel steps, my clothes torn, face covered in ash and dried blood. The paramedics said I was muttering something in Latin, phrases no one understood. When I woke up in the hospital, there was a rosary in my hand, but I don't own a rosary. It was silver, cold, and it hummed. I asked the nurse about the village, Viduva. She blinked, told me no such place showed up in the recent incident reports. I gave her the coordinates. Still nothing. She looked at me like I was hallucinating. But I know what I saw. I remember the screaming, the heat, the way the stone altar split like it was breathing. I remember Neves, his eyes like mirrors, his voice like a sermon wrapped in a threat. Most of all, I remember the bell. It rang 3 times before the church fell silent again. Once for the dead, once for the lost, and once for me. The Vatican hasn't reached out. I don't expect they will. I was unofficially operating after all. I doubt they even knew I was alive. But 2 days ago something happened. A priest from a nearby town, Father Iosif, called this clinic. The nurse said he asked for me by name. She thought it was a family member. But I don't have any. He said, "Tell Edward, he was right. It's moving. It's wearing the skin again." Then he hung up. And that night, he hung himself in his sacristy. They found writing on the church walls, carved in blood. Confession is not enough. I should run. Leave Romania. Go somewhere warm. Somewhere with no chapels or cold wind or bells that ring on their own. But I won't. Because I saw the way Neves looked at me before the end. He wasn't afraid. He was waiting. And I have a feeling. I was never meant to seal him. Only to open the way. So I'm writing this now, while my hands still work. While I still remember. Because if you're reading this, then it means I'm already too late. Again,